Yes. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about tell the same.
Well, I was standing right there with water up to here when it happened.
Right here?
I know, that's my property that everyone's working on across.
Oh, right there.
So if you saw it on Facebook, the owner was floating. That was you. So the tide was high, I think, around 420. And
Buddy.
the tide was starting to drop. I should have stored some people. I'm just so and then a couple of big ones came over the breakwater, Floyd's breakwater, and then the surge just walked it. So if you look at the point over there,
my spot.
the breakwater let go. All the boulders were thrown out of the wave.
Excuse me.
And a wave came in,
Thank you.
picked up, shut up, and said, the ones that are down the far end are all the way up to the first water bowl.
Yeah. So you're looking for cutaways later.
A video on my phone of the water running into the lake as fast as I've ever seen it run out of the lake. So it was just an amazing amount of power coming through to see that. When you think about it, a square meter of water is packed, and we have 6 feet of water rushing in full width straight up.
That concrete we're looking at there.
That's the breakwater. If you look at the piece in the water, you see out in the end, that's actually light. That piece is 20 feet or so to the north of where it used to be and sunk down. It was actually not in its proper place anymore. So we get any weather now. No one will rebuild anything. So the community's making a hard hit. There's no doubt about it. I'm fortunate enough that we've got a large family. A bunch of friends have come, and we've been cutting and chainsawing for the last 3 days to try to remove debris out of the water to reduce any floating hazards and give private property out of the water. But believe it or not, my old, and I have the oldest fishing boat in the cove, sat on that pier and floated like a duck through the hole. So no, it survived. We jumped in and turned the key in and moved it over to a neighbor. Came over and said, just tie your boat to my wharf and get it over and make an arrangement to have it taken out next week in San Bro. But I mean, you see where the float is over there, what they're standing on. That is actually about 30 feet to the north of where it was moored. It drug the 5-ton moorings that are holding that down with it. And the surge just lifted everything. It was like a roller coaster. And there was a wave of water.
So what time did it happen?
That was the 4:30.
So was that
Yeah, the tide started to drop, but when the breakwater broke, the tide dropping was not enough because we actually started to see a little, just mist. I mean, it would have started going down, I think, at 4:20. So it was about 20 minutes on the down when that breakwater broke and the surge just went over there.
How many big shacks do you think?
Down, I think we had, there was 7 shacks and probably 12 more lost, and another half. I don't think any were actually went totally empty. A lot of them, what happened?
Not a problem at all, guys. Basically, all
settled again. The bottom is perfect. Rocks have fallen out. And that you actually have, in one sense, more work to do.
Not a problem at all, guys.
Thanks. You got to disassemble to build it. If it's been clean, well, you lost everything and you get to start over again.
So see the cribs are all different ages.
Those curves, well, there's 3 of them that aren't even there anymore. If you look over there, the small one in there was over there. That's mine. I have to go get that yet. It's full of rocks that are
All right, so just move everybody down over here. Please be careful.
What's the step?
No.
How are you?
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Minister Sajjan, Minister Jordan, and I have had the opportunity today to meet with some of the Canadian Forces personnel who have been at work in the relief and recovery effort in response to Hurricane Dorian, and we're very glad to be joined by MPs Andy Fillmore, Darren Fisher and Daryl Sampson. We have 2 goals in our visit to Halifax and to Nova Scotia today. Number 1, from the point of view of ministers that need to design and manage disaster response programs. We visit the sites wherever these happen across the country in order to learn as much as we can about what worked and what didn't work, and how we can make the program stronger and better for the future. So this is a learning exercise from a governmental policy point of view, and we also want to say thank you to the first responders of all kinds and to the Canadian Forces personnel who are helping people to try to get things back to a more normal state of affairs. And finally, we simply want to demonstrate to Canadians everywhere that this is serious. The Government of Canada takes it seriously, and we're all in this together. When there's trouble afflicting any part of Canada, we have each other's backs, and we respond in a strong and collective way. So on behalf of the Government of Canada, we first want to express deep concern for all of those who have been affected by this storm, both here in the Maritimes and of course in the Bahamas and the United States before Dorian even got here. We're extremely grateful for the fact that as far as we know here in Canada, there have been no reported fatalities as a result of Dorian and no serious injuries. And that is certainly gratifying information. We also, as I said, want to express our deepest thanks to the frontline responders, the many people who are coming together to help deal with this disaster, to restore essential services and protect the public. Amazing local teams of various levels of government, provincial, municipal, some in the private sector, assisted by the Canadian Armed Forces and by technical crews that have come from other provinces and indeed from a number of states in the United States. This is a Herculean effort across municipalities, the RCMP, local police and fire departments, transportation, public works, parks crews, volunteers, health agencies, and many more. Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to speak to all of my public safety counterparts at the provincial level in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and Labrador, and of course here in Nova Scotia with Minister Porter. My purpose was to tell them, this was before the storm had arrived, to tell them that the Government of Canada was ready to respond to any provincial request, and such a request did in fact arrive from Minister Porter. He made that request before Dorian actually hit Nova Scotia, and that proactive step on his part, indicating that from what all the evidence you could see in the United States and in the Bahamas, this was going to exceed provincial capacity to cope with the consequences of Dorian. So he put in the request before the storm actually arrived, which made it possible for the Government of Canada and particularly the Canadian Armed Forces to lean forward, to prepare in advance, and to make sure that, that we were in the best possible position to respond. Since Sunday morning, approximately 350 or so military personnel from Atlantic Canada have been deployed to various places in Nova Scotia to help restore electricity, clear roadways, evacuate residents in certain flooded areas. As well, the Canadian Coast Guard has been deployed with helicopters to ferry personnel and equipment, as well as to assess damage to local infrastructure. I would also note that there are a number of other federal departments that are involved and engaged, probably a dozen or more that have had a role to play in assisting in present circumstances. One I would mention in particular is ISED, the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. That portfolio carries the responsibility for communications and telecommunications, and they have been working proactively with communication service providers to be of assistance in trying to restore service where there have been gaps. Emergency crews are making good progress, but to be clear, we're still in the early days of this response. Downed trees and power lines, multiple road closures and washouts are still a very real concern. So is cell service, as we've heard loud and clear from a number of people in the course of today. Damage assessment is ongoing. In these circumstances, provincial authorities take the lead. The Government of Canada is there to offer assistance as requested by the province, and we are determined to meet every request that comes in from Nova Scotia as we have thus far. The overall main effort for each province is of course this situation affects not just Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is the epicenter, but there are impacts in New Brunswick, impacts in Prince Edward Island, impacts in parts of Quebec and the Gulf and so forth. Less so in Newfoundland and Labrador. But the main objective is to restore the electrical grid as well as telephone service. One thing I would say about that is for those who have been affected by what they consider to be faulty or deficient telephone services, they should make sure that they make their concerns known to the CRTC. The CRTC is a regulatory authority that has the legal responsibility for regulations in the telecommunications sector, and they need to know if customers across the country are believing that that their circumstances in response to an emergency have not been at the level that they would have a right to expect. So for those who have concerns about cell service and other telecommunication services, make sure you make that concern known to the CRTC. The second objective will be cleanup activities, obviously, as we see even around us here, as well as reducing the impact on critical infrastructure as well as transportation. We would like to encourage all residents that have been impacted to follow the directions and the advice of their local municipal law enforcement authorities and other first responders. They are working in a very professional manner to deal with this situation, and the best advice is to follow their advice in order to keep everybody safe and to proceed in the most effective way. I also want to comment on one other thing I've heard repeatedly today. In addition to the levels of government, in addition to all of the professional first responders who are doing such an extraordinary job, and the Canadian Armed Forces, people have also spoken very positively about their friends and their neighbors and their communities, and how this community has responded so well. And again, that's a demonstration of the Canadian way of doing things, and to all of those who have given that extra hand to a friend or a neighbor or a total stranger that needed help in these circumstances, thank you for that invaluable service. Those thousands of random acts of kindness can make a huge difference. The Government Operations Centre, which is housed in my Department of Public Safety Canada, along with the regional offices of Public Safety Canada, are coordinating the federal and provincial response efforts to maintain situational awareness and to ensure full coordination in the responses. We will continue to respond promptly to all of the provincial requests that we receive. Going forward, we're not to this stage yet. We're still in the immediate response stage of dealing with this storm and disaster. But the next phase of this will be the consultations we will go through with the province of Nova Scotia about the disaster financial assistance arrangement, which is the federal provincial cost sharing arrangement. It's already in place, doesn't have to be negotiated. The terms and conditions are there. The province of Nova Scotia will be obviously doing their calculations about the costs and the losses and the damages and what kind of an official response there will be to that in terms of compensation measures and so forth. And under the DFAA, Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement, the first portion of the losses are borne by the provincial government, but as those losses rise above about $3 million, then the Government of Canada has a cost-sharing formula where, first of all, we pay 25%, and then we pay 50%, and then we pay 75%, and then 90%. So the higher the loss becomes, the bigger the share that is assumed by the Government of Canada. There's also another program that I'll mention, and I'll close on this, called the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. This is a $2 billion federal fund to build more resilient infrastructure to deal with the consequences of climate change and more severe weather. Hurricanes, storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, all of that are accelerating across Canada. And the DMAF, as it's called, is an effort by the Government of Canada to work with provinces to build more resilient types of infrastructure for protection of shoreline, for example, for the protection of utilities inland, to fend off flooding and those sorts of circumstances. So far, the DMAF program has invested just in the last year or so about $109 million in various projects across Atlantic Canada. But it's the type of program that we are going to have to renew and strengthen and build upon for the future, because the consequences of climate change are growing more and more significant and costly, and it makes a lot more sense to invest in the infrastructure up front to head off the problem rather than just cleaning up the mess after it has happened. And now I'd like to ask my colleague, the Minister of National Defence, to comment specifically on the work of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thank you, Ralph. I just want to take this opportunity to also to thank all our first responders and the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces who've done tremendous work. Minister Goodale and I respond to many disasters across Canada, and one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we were there, our troops and all our resources at the federal level, to support the Canadians at time of need. And in this case here, I also want to thank the provincial government for proactively looking at the situation in Hurricane Dorian, where it allowed us to be able to lean forward, put resources in the right place, and in terms of the Canadian Armed Forces, put 700 personnel on standby with all the right resources to anticipate any type of the damage. And this allowed us to have the flexibility to respond to the various emergencies. And our Canadian Armed Forces personnel are right now deployed all over the province, providing that service. And they will always be there at time for Canadians. I also want to emphasize that the Canadian Armed Forces will not be doing any cost recovery, and we have not done so for any disasters. But we also need to be very mindful, as Minister Goodale says, the impact of climate change is having a drastic impact on our country, from floods to fires to hurricane response. And this is something that we need to be very mindful as a nation, and adjusting our response, and more importantly, having the preventative measures in place. I also want to highlight our Canadian Armed Forces work internationally as well, with Hurricane Dorian and the impact that it had on in the Bahamas. where we do have Canadian Armed Forces personnel on the ground. We have Canadian Armed Forces Air Force personnel deploying, the Jamaican Disaster Assistance Response Team as we speak, and our folks are on the ground doing the assessment if our own DART team is going to be needed, and if it is, we are prepared to deploy that as well. So once again, I want to thank all Canadians for pitching in. We met some Salvation Army folks providing coffee to the people who are fixing the lines. It just, at times like this, when people come together, it just makes us so proud to be Canadian and help each other at time of need. And I just want to thank everybody once again. Minister.
Thank you, and I just want to thank everyone for being here today, as well as thank our members of the Canadian Armed Forces, our first responders. This has been, particularly rough for those of us who live in Atlantic Canada and in Nova Scotia particularly, in coastal communities, seeing what's happening right across the province with power outages, with downed trees, with flooding in a lot of cases. And it's been very difficult, but we've all pulled together. It's been an experience where we've seen municipalities, provincial governments, federal government, first responders, the military all come in and do what they need to do in order to make sure that we're looking after the people of Nova Scotia. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been part of that, as well as, we learn. Every time something like this happens, we learn from it. And knowing how important it is for people to get information is critical. So making sure people have access to good cell phone coverage. I know in rural communities particularly, there's been a lot of concerns about the cell phone coverage. Those are things that we will have to assess and look at and figure out how we're going to go forward and make sure that people have the information they need when something like this happens. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Okay, if you have a few questions.
Can we start off with just being clear that there has been no financial ask yet on the behalf of Nova Scotia to the federal government?
No, it's far too early for that. In the first few hours of a disaster situation, whether it's a horrible storm like this, or the tornado that hit Ottawa last year, or the fires in British Columbia or Alberta, the flooding and in Quebec and Ontario, New Brunswick, in the first several days, your focus is on the immediate restoration of normalcy and security in people's lives. And that's what we're all riveted upon, and that's why the province of Nova Scotia made that early request to the Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that as quickly as possible the trees got removed from the road and the power systems got restored and so forth. The next stage is planning recovery and restoration and figuring out how to pay for it. Significant portions of certain losses will be covered by normal insurance, but beyond that, the province will be adding up their public costs. They'll also be deciding what types of other compensation measures are appropriate and necessary to deal with losses by ordinary citizens or by small business and so forth. The province will design what they feel is necessary to respond properly for people to fully recover. And then under the DFAA, the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement, there is a cost-sharing formula where as the costs rise, the federal share rises as well. It's a formula that's worked pretty well over the years. It's been applied in Fort McMurray and in British Columbia and in New Brunswick and Ontario and Quebec, everywhere, and it's proven to be very successful. So it's just too early for the province to have a firm fix on what the arithmetic really is. One of the things we can do, though, and we will, if this is helpful to Nova Scotia, is arrange for an advance payment. If they can calculate in broad terms what they expect the loss is likely to be, then the Government of Canada can verify that arithmetic and in advance make a payment on account, if you will, to the province of Nova Scotia, so that they don't have a cash flow problem in managing the numbers. Often it takes provinces 5 years or more to actually do the calculations. And that's only natural in the circumstances. So that's why we've put this advance payment arrangement into place to get some needed cash into their hands very, very early, if that's helpful to them.
Minister Goodale, we have a former CSIS operative in custody after attempting suicide over the weekend to prevent his deportation. Do we owe him anything?
You understand that under the law, I'm prohibited from commenting on specific cases, and I don't comment on operational matters. But I would say this: to the best of my knowledge, in this case, there is no immediate deportation step that is being taken. There are a number of legal steps in the process that have to unfold. This individual obviously has very proactive legal advice, and the Government of Canada will ensure that every legal step is properly followed according to the laws of Canada.
So your department has been working with his lawyer?
No, only through courts. As you understand, he's it's an adversarial situation through a tribunal and through a court system. So, but the individual, there are steps legally that must be followed in order to deal with deportation according to law. We will follow all of those steps appropriately, and there is no immediate deportation about to happen in the next day or so.
So it's been deferred, his deportation?
Yeah, there's nothing that's going to happen immediately. There are legal steps that are available to this individual, and he has obviously very good legal advice, and I presume he'll be well counseled about what he needs to do in order to pursue what he considers to be his rights.
So he likely won't be deported?
I'm not prejudging what the end of that process is. What I'm saying is that there's no step immediately about to be taken. There are legal proceedings that need to be followed, and that those legal proceedings will determine what is the final resolution of the case.
Minister Sajjan, you've talked about climate change before and how the Canadian military is probably going to get more involved in these kind of situations. However, yesterday I watched the squad stand around for hours because they couldn't chop up a tree because they needed an electrician to come along. Is the Canadian military prepared? Do you need more personnel to actually get the job done?
First of all, when we released our defense policy, we went through a very thorough analysis on the needs of what it takes to have all the resources in Canada. And we now have the right investment in place to do so. What you're talking about there is we don't want to put our Canadian Armed Forces personnel at risk. When there's a tree down and there's a power line that's down, our Canadian Armed Forces personnel are not trained to make the assessment whether the line is live or not. And so they have to go through the appropriate process, and we need to be very mindful of this. I recall actually during one of the Winnipeg floods where we lost a soldier to a power line issue. So these are steps of when because of the coordination that we have been doing quite extensively with all the provinces across Canada because of the various disasters. We're able to look at what type of procedures are in place. In fact, we had a good discussion about this, and I'm very happy with these procedures in place. Not only it keeps our personnel safe, but our Canadian Armed Forces personnel are able to support these neighborhoods in a timely manner as well. Thank you.
Mr. Goodale, can we talk about cell phones for a minute and internet? There's obviously a lot of concern. You mentioned, several ministers mentioned that they've been hearing it loud and clear. What does this say about the vulnerability of cell phones and internet services, especially in rural areas, and what can the government do? Because people are obviously quite upset.
Well, as you know, the Government of Canada in our last budget announced a significant investment over the next 5 and then 10 years to ensure that all Canadians have access to high-speed internet of high quality wherever they may live in the country, without the quality of their service or the availability of the service depending on their postal code. So those investment programs are coming into effect now. Some have existed in the past, but this extra funding from the last budget will allow us to accelerate the process. And indeed, that's Minister Jordan's responsibility under her responsibilities for rural Canada. So that part of it is moving forward. But it is critically important in this day and age for all Canadians to have access to the very best possible quality and level of telecommunications services. It's not just a frill that is nice to have. In the highly competitive world in which we live, if you don't have access to those services, you are at a decided disadvantage, and obviously in circumstances like this past weekend, you can be at risk as well because of the health and safety considerations that are involved. So we are very anxious to ensure that as we move forward, that Canadians everywhere in this country have access to top quality cell and internet services. And I should let the minister responsible comment. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's it's a very good question, and it's something that we've actually been working very hard on, is making sure Canadians have access to high-speed, affordable internet as well as cell phone coverage. We've already made significant investments. We have ambitious targets to connect everybody in the country, 100% of Canadians. But we know it's more than just economic development; it's about safety as well. We've seen that obviously firsthand here this weekend in Atlantic Canada, and we know that going forward, the investments that we're making are going to pay off. It does take time to build the infrastructure that we need. It's infrastructure just like any other infrastructure, but we are definitely committed to making sure that we connect all of Canadians.
We got time for one more question, sorry.
You mentioned this CRTC, Mr. Goodale. I was wondering, should there be minimum standards for backup systems in the case of power outages?
This is obviously a situation right from this past weekend that a significant number of Canadians in Nova Scotia believe requires substantially more attention and consideration. So that's why I'm encouraging people, if you've suffered from a telephone service, a telecommunications service failure that you believe left you in a vulnerable position. It's very important for the government to hear that, and that's a point that is very well taken among the ministers and MPs that have been here today. But even more so, let the regulatory body know, so that the CRTC can also examine whether or not the levels and the reliability of service is in fact adequate. Now, bear in mind, what happened here on the weekend is probably the second worst Atlantic storm ever on record. It may have been the worst, but it was certainly the second worst on record. So these were totally extraordinary circumstances, and you have to factor that into your decision making. But we need to build infrastructure, including telecommunications infrastructure, in this country that is increasingly resistant to abnormal circumstances, because, at least for one reason, the accelerating consequences of climate change that mean we're going to have more tornadoes, more hurricanes, more floods, more droughts, more abnormal circumstances. They're going to last longer, they're going to be more severe, and we have to build infrastructure that will better withstand the consequences of those circumstances. And one of the ways that we would do that is through this program that I referred to, the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, a $2 billion fund that we have established. And so far it's working very well, but we're just into the second year of that program. But that's the whole point, to have all kinds of infrastructure including telecommunications infrastructure, that is up to the task of withstanding a world in which climate change is causing new risks and threats and dangers that we've never experienced before.
In terms of cost, I'm just wondering what the estimates or range of estimates are for the damage and the cost of all this. I know you're saying it's early and you're still discussing with the province or provinces, but we safely ballpark number.
I cannot give you that number because I would be encroaching on the jurisdiction of the province. In fact, I'm going right now to meet Minister Porter, and I'm sure that this is one of the topics that we will be discussing. But in fairness, Nova Scotia really hasn't had the opportunity in just the last 48 hours to do any kind of serious calculation. What they've been focused on is making sure that people are safe and they are restoring the basic features of normal life in Nova Scotia. That's their priority. That should be their priority. But very quickly, they will turn their attention to the issue of cost.
Sorry, thank you, everybody. No, that's, thank you. Can farmers apply for that fund as well, or is that a separate? Just to be clear.
There is a separate set of programming for agriculture. It's called the Canadian Agricultural Program. Under that program, there are tools called the Business Risk Management Tools, which are designed specifically for agricultural situations and agricultural emergencies. A couple of years ago, when we had the big fires in British Columbia, a number of pastures were damaged. Farmers had to disperse their herds. They had to rebuild their fence lines and so forth. And between the federal government and the province, there was a cost-shared program that provided, I think if my memory serves me correctly, about $20 million to restore the portions of the British Columbia economy in agriculture that were damaged by the fires. So there's a range of programs, but in this particular case, the agricultural programming would come under the Canadian Agricultural Program.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, I would say. And he got thrown up here. So you can imagine the fourth that came away.